Hey there! Welcome to Culture by Culture, a multidimensional exploration of Black and Asian pop cultural ties. I'm your one and only host, Delia, and today I am super excited because we're wrapping up season 1 of Culture by Culture! Yeah! Editing Delia, put in applause. Just kidding. I'm not going to do that. I debated how I was going to wrap up this season. Should I get a big name guest? Should I do some sort of, compilation? But you know what? I realized that I am so busy interviewing guests, making sure their views and experiences are represented, working on the post-production, all of that stuff, that I think I kind of forget to share my own perspective about things. And that does come through because there is a lot that y'all are curious about. I get questions from comments, from emails, all of that stuff. So today is a solo episode. It's my first solo episode. I'm so excited. I'm a little nervous. I don't have a guest to give me feedback if this is going well, but I'm glad you're here listening. So today what we're going to do is go through all the questions that I've received across the season. Some of them are going to be from socials. It'll be about the podcast itself. Some are going to be about specific episodes, and some are going to be about little old me. So let's jump into the first question. And easily, the most common question I get is not really a question at all. I lied. It's actually a comment, but it's something that I think I want to touch on. And that comment is that I didn't realize there were so many connections. I've gotten it from family members. I've gotten it from friends. I've gotten it from guests even. And I really don't know how to respond to that in the moment because, to be quite honest, I didn't either. When I started this podcast, I knew there was a lot to talk about because I started the podcast wanting to talk about my own observations and kind of just do a little exploring, see what we dig up. But what I've dug up is so much. There was so much from the historical connections, the coalitions, the musical connections, our connections in food, movies, film, theater, you name it, connections exist. There is so much. It is such a rich tapestry of connection between the various Asian cultures and Black culture. So I guess my response to that is, yeah, I know, right? This next question is a personal question. I maybe wouldn't recommend asking it in normal context, but in the context of Culture by Culture, it makes sense why people are asking. So the question is, are you Blasian? And if not, what are you? So I will get out of the way that no, I'm not Blasian. I am mixed, but I'm not Blasian. I understand why people ask because I think people assume to have such an interest in these cultural connections that I must be Blasian and experiencing these cultural connections firsthand. And I do think I would never deny that Blasian people do have a unique voice on this topic. And I hope, as a fellow mixed person, to have more Blasian people on the podcast to talk about their unique experiences navigating the world being Black and Asian, whatever that means for them. But for me, I'm coming at it from the perspective as a fan of pop culture, specifically for me, a fan of Asian pop culture. And I hope to also engage Asians who are fans of Black pop culture. And I find that connection very interesting and important. And I don't think you need to be Blasian for that to be important, you know? And for those still wondering, okay, but can I ask, what are you though? Like I said, I am mixed. I am Black. So that's half the podcast, right? And Chi Chalagi, which means I am Cherokee, which is kind of the full limit of my Cherokee language knowledge, but we're working on it all the time. So thanks for asking. Don't ask strangers these questions, but in this context, I hope I answered satisfactorily. The next question that I get a lot in general about the podcast is, what about insert this cultural connection? Currently, this podcast, the one you're listening to, kind listener, Culture by Culture, is a podcast about Black and Asian pop cultural connections. The catalyst for the podcast, I mentioned this in our first episode, I'm sure I've sprinkled this tidbit here and there, was my own observations existing in Asian pop culture fandoms and learning about various Asian cultures and engaging with Asian people. So therefore, I'm focused on these specific cultural interactions because they're what piqued my interest. They're specific to me. Plus, I do think it's possible to highlight a specific thing without it being to the detriment of another thing. That said, is there a possible reality where Culture by Culture blows up and goes on so long that it makes sense to do a spinoff and look at other Black cultural connections? Oh yeah, for sure. It'd be super fun. But that's just not really my current focus or aim. But, subscribe, share with your friends. You never know. Now, shifting gears a little bit to the more kind of episode specific questions that I've gotten. This is a 2-for-1, kind of. So it might be cheating a little bit. One question I get based on my conversation with Sarah Phillips from the Language Learning and Cultural Navigation conversation is, what has my language learning journey been like as a Black person? I also have gotten questions from the We Got the K-pop Beat episode about how I am beating the Koreaboo allegations. Because if you'll remember from the episode, there's this funny moment where I asked them all how they're beating the Koreaboo allegations. For starters, let me define Koreaboo for people who may not know. Koreaboo derives from the word weeaboo, which is like a hyper fan of anime culture, or kind of Japanese culture by way of anime. Koreaboo, similar by way of K-pop and K-dramas, but it's kind of derogatory, and usually these people might fetishize the culture, they might appropriate the culture inappropriately, those types of things. So how do I beat those allegations? I kind of talked about this actually a few weeks back on the live stream I did with Anime Relatable. I'll link it in the show notes, check it out. But I kind of don't beat them, and that's not to say I am a Koreaboo. I definitely don't think I am. But I just kind of don't worry about it. Like, sure, does my enthusiasm for Korean culture specifically look suspiciously like Koreaboo behavior here and there? Probably. But having grown up kind of like a weeb, which is short for weeaboo, in my youth, being a preteen, young teenager who was super enthusiastic about Japanese culture because she watched anime and maybe didn't go about it the best way all the time. Do I think I'm there anymore? Absolutely not. I've done a lot of growing. I know what it is to be responsible and not responsible, if that makes sense. I feel confident in my sincerity, my curiosity, and my respect when it comes to how I approach different cultures. So I don't really worry about it. So far in my journey, I think that's come through in my behavior and how I interact with people. And I think overall it's been received well. And honestly, that's really all you can do. If you think you're being a weeaboo or a Koreaboo, ask friends, have them call you in. Hopefully make friends with people from the cultures you really admire. They will tell you if you're doing something wrong. And I think that's ideal. So kind of segueing nicely into learning languages, some people fear learning a language because they don't want to be seen as a Koreaboo or a weeaboo or whatever. But I would say for me, I did that because I was so invested in the culture. I wanted to dive as deep as I could because the internet, videos, all that was not giving enough in English. It could only take me so far. So I was like, you know what? It's the pandemic. It's May 2020. I'm going to jump in and I'm going to just do it. I'm going to teach myself Korean. Teaching myself only went so far. I will be clear. I'm not self-taught. For the most part. But does that mean I haven't met any Koreaboos in my language learning journey? No, I absolutely have. Definitely have. But I will say in a language learning setting, but especially a classroom setting, nobody really cares. We're all just enthusiastic to be learning this thing we're all really interested in. And likewise, the people teaching the language are super enthusiastic that you're so invested in their culture. Like, that's really cool. It's a really cool exchange that is happening. And you know, I know, especially for Black people who are wanting to learn different languages, it could be a bit fraught, kind of globally, because anti-Blackness is global. So I've been really lucky in my experience. I haven't really had bad experiences. Like, have there been times where I've been a little nervous because we're getting into some shaky territory with whatever cultural topic we're covering? Like, am I gonna have to navigate talking about colorism and white essentialism in this class where I am definitely in the minority? Yes, I've had those uncomfortable moments, but luckily enough for me, I've just had pretty progressive teachers and classmates also that, you know, have kind of handled the conversation, or the conversation didn't really go where I thought it was going to go or feared where it was going to go. So it hasn't come up for me. I've been very lucky. I would say if you're looking for advice on how to learn a language, I would listen to my episode with Sarah, Language Learning and Cultural Navigation, but also hit up subreddits, hit up the internet. Subreddits will get you together as far as where you need to start to learn any language, especially for free. So start there. Don't be scared. No fear, Shakespeare. You got this. And if you're worried about being a Koreaboo, weeaboo, whatever, and you're scared to learn, don't. Firstly, that can be unlearned, but also your concern is the first step. Related to the Koreaboo, weeaboo type of conversation is a question that I have talked about with guests, has come up. People have kind of asked me about it as well in interviews I've done in other places. The question being, why is Black representation important in non-Western media? We especially talked about it, I know for sure, in the Black Girls and K-Dramas episode with Black Girl Soul. And I've let the guests give their perspectives and their answers, what they think. And I don't think I've ever really highlighted my specific opinion. So I'm going to lay it out here very neatly. My opinion is, first and foremost, is the obvious. American culture is Black culture. We are exporting Black culture, and that influences the cultures that we're taking in, whether that be anime, K-dramas, K-pop, even Bollywood dances. Like, these things are fusions and amalgamations of the cultures that they are taking in. And, you know, you can have a conversation about American hegemony, cultural imperialism, all of that stuff. But the fact of the matter is these things aren't inspired by Black culture. So I don't think it's too much to ask for representation and collaboration with Black people if you're going to be inspired by that type of pop culture and that media. But further than that, I also want to highlight so badly for fandoms that yes, these places are quote unquote homogenous, but that does not mean that only Japanese people live there, only Chinese, only Korean people live there. First of all, that's kind of erasure for other indigenous ethnic groups that exist in these places, but never mind that part. Secondly, Black people exist worldwide. Mr. Worldwide, we are everywhere. And to say that those stories don't have value doesn't make any sense to me. I'm going to be really honest. I've seen fans throughout my time in fandom, even when I was younger, trying to, I think, come from a good place, kind of, but also kind of a little bit of a racist place when they're trying to keep anime, K-dramas, K-pop, whatever the case is, pure. They want to make it so that it looks homogenous. I think they just want it to look not Black, to be honest. Deep down, they just don't want it to look Black. But also, I do think it does come from this weird place of trying to respect the culture. But the truth of the matter is, Black people exist there. Black Japanese people exist. Black Korean people exist. Black Filipinos exist. Black Chinese people exist. Like any country, there is Black people. And so even if it's a 0.5% of people are Black or, you know, come from multicultural families, whatever you want to call it, I think those stories are worth telling in front of the camera, in the recording booth. Like, it's not just behind the camera and in the recording studio that we need this representation. I want to see those stories. I'm curious to know what lives these people lead. As a fellow mixed person, I can only talk about my experience being mixed in America. It's going to be completely different than those who are experiencing it in other countries. And I'd love to see those stories. Yes, in, you know, documentaries and like first person accounts, but also I just want to see stories with them in it that are lighthearted and fun and maybe some sad. I don't think that's too much to ask. And, you know, I hope we're getting there. Anime has improved a lot as far as its representation of foreign experiences. Korean dramas have kind of started flirting with the idea of like other people. And I just hope that trend continues. I really, really do. So this next question I put in here, I'm going to be honest, it's not a question anybody has asked me, but I asked it of myself a lot in the whole lead up to this podcast, during the podcast. And that question is what I do activism? And from the onset of planning this podcast, I set out to differentiate myself from an activist because I was incredibly mindful of the space I was entering. I knew that there were people already on the ground doing that work. I knew that there were historical coalitions that predate my existence, and I did not want to disrupt anything or be presumptuous. I'm just a humble podcaster wanting to talk about these pop cultural connections. So I did my very best in my branding, in my planning, to be very clear about that, and also identifying people who could speak to those things as they came up as needed. And that way I could use the space to give that work a voice without positioning myself as any sort of authority on that, because I am not. But it was after speaking with Jason and Rohan, but especially Rohan in their episode, Finding Joy in Activism Through Coalition, that I started to shift the way I was thinking about it. You know, I've always been of the mindset in general when it comes to activist work that it takes all kinds, right? Like you need people in the streets marching, but you also need people writing petitions, writing their senators. You need people having one-on-one conversations at home. You need people in the church. You need people making graphics. Like you need all sorts of people doing the thing, right? But I didn't really properly contextualize myself and that work when I was imagining what the podcast would be. And as the podcast took off and I had more conversations with guests and listeners alike, and having talked to Rohan, I just began to realize that, oh, what I'm doing does have a place in this social change ecosystem. Like, it is changing minds. It's part of that conversation. And it feels silly that it took getting to that point to realize that, oh, I'm in the conversation, but I really didn't. So to the question, is what I do activism? I think in a way, yes. Would I say it's an activist podcast? No, but I think it shares in that work. And I'm very proud to do that. And I'm very proud to continue to platform people who are on the ground doing that work. Similarly, another question that I don't get specifically, but I get a lot of questions around it. And I think they can be best summed up with the question, is this a political podcast? No? Question mark. When I set out to make the podcast, I very purposefully was not going to talk about politics, in that I don't particularly care to represent Democratic views or Republican views. Definitely not Republican views, let's be clear. But I wasn't going to do either because, first of all, I'm not loyal to a party like that. But second of all, that's a very American lens to view everything through. And when I'm talking about cross-cultural exchange, I don't think that makes sense to position the podcast in any way like that. Like, that's not even what we're talking about right now. However, if you listen to the Black Allyship in Print and Beyond episodes with Janina Ong and Sarah Park from Mochi Mag, or the sort of follow-up podcast episode, Let's Talk Affirmative Action with Janina, she said something in one of those episodes talking about how our whole existence is political. And I absolutely agree with her. In America, because we're such a racialized society, if you are a different race that is not white, your existence is politicized by other people. And so, yes, by being a Black woman, a Cherokee woman, a mixed woman, talking about these issues, like, is it technically inherently political? Yeah, people are going to view it that way. They're going to think that I'm saying something radical if they don't like it, or maybe if they like it too. I don't know. And I'm kind of okay with that. So I wouldn't say that's enough to brand the podcast as political, but if you take that to be true, then I guess you could derive that answer. And furthermore, I don't really know how to talk about cultural exchange, especially as an American, without looking critically at American hegemony, capitalism, Western imperialism, and the effects of our military-industrial complex. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about those things as they came up, because they absolutely affect how our cultural exchange is happening. White supremacy has affected how Asian Americans and Black Americans have interacted with each other 100%. I can't not mention those things, and I can't not use those lenses when I'm studying for the podcast and studying topics surrounding the work that I do. And likewise, when I talk about historical figures, which I don't think I've done a lot of yet on this podcast, but you'll know if you follow me on Instagram, I have kind of what ended up being a mini series that wasn't the intent at first, called Black and Asian Cultural Connections You Should Know. We cover some historical figures, and without fail, there is always someone who's like, okay, but she was a communist. And it's usually about the women figures, never about the men. I don't take that for what you will, despite their political ideologies being pretty aligned. And I never really know what to say to that, because yes, yeah, I don't, what do you want me to say to that? A lot of early coalition work was the work of socialism, was Maoist work. It is what it is. Historically, that's what's happened. I'm not going to not talk about that because it was important to that work. And I think if these ideologies keep coming up in work that's talking about cultural connection and equity, maybe that's something for people to think about. That's just what I'm saying. Am I a communist? No. Am I going to go and defend Grace Lee Boggs in the comments when somebody accuses her, quote unquote, of being a communist? Also, no, because yeah, I don't know what to tell you, basically. So no, this is not literally a socialist podcast, but it focuses a lot on the foundation and the work of socialists, and you can take that for what you will. So we've talked about disagreeing with some commenters, but do I ever disagree with my guests? It's a question that I haven't gotten explicitly, but it has been implied. And so to answer, sometimes, kind of. I will say when I reach out to guests and I bring them on to the show, my larger goal is to let people give voice to their experiences. So generally, I'm not going to disagree with them because their experience is their experience. Our experiences may not align, they may differ. In fact, that's even more interesting to talk about sometimes. So it's not really come up that there's been a place where I've been like, no, that's not true. There may have been times where you've heard me say, oh, that's interesting. When I was younger, this is how it was. Or, oh, really? That's your experience in fandom? Well, it's been like this for me. And that's not necessarily disagreeing with them because neither of us are wrong. As far as like straight up disagreeing, what you're saying is harmful. I can't believe you would say something like this. That type of disagreement, like the cheese nay. Luckily, again, my guests have been great. It really hasn't come up this season. I'm not just saying that to cover for anyone. I would say if anything like that did happen, more than likely, like you wouldn't hear it because I think I would just make an editorial decision of how to share it. If I thought for some reason it was important to showcase that side of the guest for whatever reason, or more than likely to remove it because I'm not going to spread harmful information or misinformation or anything like that because I take this podcast and this platform very seriously. I might push back on it. You may hear like a back and forth, but sometimes things are just not worth derailing a whole interview about, especially if I know I'm just going to cut it. Like, I'm not going to do a back and forth. I'm just going to be like, oh, interesting, and move on. But what has come up, if anything, has been moments of ambiguity where my guest and I are having a conversation and we're having this really good back and forth. We're all understanding each other. Everything's fine. But then when I go back to listen to it again and do the edit, I realize, oh, that wasn't very clear from my guest, and I can see how that can be misinterpreted. I try to, when I'm doing the edit, think as a listener. And if I think something is ambiguous as a listener, yeah, I'm going to remove it or I'm going to edit in some way to make it clearer or jump in and make a editing Delia here moment because I don't want to have any unnecessary understandings between my audience and the guest, especially when I know the guest's intent wasn't anything harmful or bad or anything like that. So, do I disagree with my guests? Not really so far. Will I? Probably. And that's fine. And I will navigate it as it comes. But no tea yet. Now, this next question is not a question that I think comes from anyone who actually listens to the podcast, but especially around the time of the Coalition Power BTS Army with June's Melanin drop, Grace. Around that time, I did get questions basically to the sentiment of how can you be a fan of these things and reconcile the exploitation of Black people, or how can I ignore the harm done? And again, I don't know. I don't think any of y'all are asking this because if you're here, you're also a fan of the things. Hi, welcome. That said, for the people who ask that, anyways, I will answer it. I have always practiced what is called critical fandom. And critical fandom, if you haven't heard of it or you're new to it, is just the concept, essentially, of being able to love a thing and still critique it. And in fact, you're often critiquing the thing out of your love for it. So what does that mean? That means I can love BTS and critique if and when they slip up and do cultural appropriation. I can love K-dramas, but decide I'm not going to watch a K-drama where somebody's in dreads and they're talking about how he smells. I can critique an anime when they draw a Black person's lips just a little too wonky. You know what I mean. If you know, you know. But I can still enjoy that thing. And the reason to critique the thing, even though you still love it, is because you want it to be better. And that's where I've always lived. So I've never really felt that cognitive dissonance of like, okay, but K-pop has exploited Black people and their cultural creations and et cetera, because I'm like, yeah, and we should talk about it. Also, this is a bop. Like, I think two things can exist at once, and that's kind of where I like to exist. So in fact, I'm really not ignoring anything. In fact, I want people to talk about the hard stuff. In fact, I think in fandom, it can be hard sometimes. I think people who are kind of in a more casual fandom space, which there's nothing wrong with, or people who just really kind of lose their identity to the fandom, which I talked about with Mars Sebastian in our episode. I think it's really, really easy to just want to defend the thing by any means necessary. And I just don't find that very valuable for me personally in my fandom. And I really encourage folks to look at their fandoms, see what's going on, see what's wrong, where can things improve, because your thing will get a lot better when they make those improvements. And as fans, I feel like we bring a lot of value to that space. If you are a fan creator, whether you've made fan art, fan fiction, what are those called? What is it the Gen Zs do? The fan cams? There you go. They're called fan cams. Yikes. The millennial just jumped right on out. When you do fan cams, that's contributing to the fandom and making the thing grow. I see fandom as reciprocal. The creators make the thing and we celebrate the thing, and it goes back and forth like that, ideally. So critique the thing. That should be part of the conversation. Okay, but I can hear you asking, what about the fraught history, though? Why don't you talk about that? And I hear that question. I see you. I get it. And I talked a little bit about this with Janina back in those 2 episodes I mentioned. But the thing is, to me, there already exists a multitude of content regarding our fraught histories. Some do it better than others. In my opinion, though, because there's such a multitude and these stories have been weaponized against each of us, it's been propagandized by white supremacy, I just have no interest in contributing to that. And, that's not to say these histories aren't also important. They are. We have to acknowledge them to heal and grow from them. And, that which is left untended in the dark will only fester. So for me and my part, we will shine a light on those histories as they come up and as they're relevant. Like we've talked about a little bit, the LA riots. But I want my space and this podcast to exist more as a counter to the usual, and in my opinion, false narrative of scarcity and antagonism between the races, because I think there's more connection and unity than there is the opposite. So that's what my podcast focuses on. If you want to get content regarding all of the ills that we've done to each other, it's out there. I would say approach it with a critical eye, but for my part, it's good vibes here. Honesty, but good vibes. This next question is a topical one to the climate we are currently in, and I thought about making this its own bonus episode or something like that. I don't really have precedent for doing that yet, but I thought I would just include it here, and it'll be a bit of a tangent, but let's just jump into it. I've seen a lot of questions regarding strikes and responsible consumption as fans, and I wanted to talk about it. In my episode with Mars, Biases, Anime Clubs, and K-pop Printouts, we touched a bit on the strikes and their effect on fair wages on the industries we love, partly because we are both part of the Disney Be a Hero campaign. We were at their kickoff live stream, and it's just a campaign where we're asking Disney to consider all stakeholders, not just shareholders. And some people don't think that this applies to international markets, and it is true. The Writers Guild of America and SAG-AFTRA are both based in Hollywood. Therefore, they protect Hollywood workers. And currently, at the time of recording, there are no international industry strikes. However, that does not mean that other industries are not affected or that they aren't paying any attention, because I assure you, they are. Most directly affected, first and foremost, are American dub actors who are missing out on work because streamers like Crunchyroll, which is an anime streaming platform for those who don't know, won't work with SAG-AFTRA contracts. Less direct, but still important, is Netflix, an American company, and its heavy investment into global markets like Korea, India, and Japan. While it has undoubtedly invested into these industries and had positive effects, it does so by paying local production companies, which means it doesn't work directly with actors, directors, writers, etc. And because of this, it is not itself a broadcaster, which means it isn't paying residuals or overseeing labor conditions, and it isn't required to. There is also little protection in regards to who is credited on works exclusive to streaming services. Netflix specifically has avoided talking to Korean unions and engaging in collective bargaining conversations in India. Similarly, money has flooded media companies in Japan, but the wage gap within the anime industry has only intensified as it leans more heavily on poorly paid freelancers to meet demand, while big media companies pocket increased profits. And because it leans on freelancers, they can't easily organize. And all of that is just scratching the surface. I will link some resources in the show notes if you'd like to read more about labor conditions on your own and how it affects all global industries. But to answer the question, okay, what should we do about all of this as fans? I think simply we should listen and then speak out. Critical fandom can be hard sometimes. It's hard to hold two disparate things at the same time, but I think that we have to try. We owe it to the people who create our favorite media to try. So we should celebrate increased attention and resources poured into the media we love. But we should also listen to the people making that stuff and be critical of the powerful entities that don't support them. So that means, yes, get super excited about Squid Game Season 2, but also be willing to call the BS on the fact that once it became a juggernaut, the creator Hwang Dong-hyuk received no additional payment, despite making the streaming platform upwards of $900 million. You can bump Natu from RRR, but be vocally skeptical about who is being credited as writers on these Indian films and what they're being paid. Shout about the newest episode of your favorite anime by all means, but be concerned for the freelancers when you see the animation quality dip under intense production demands. Listen to the people creating the media you love and hold the people who hold power over them, hold their feet to the fire. If these strikes resolve and demands are met and all of that stuff, and that starts affecting these industries, I will talk about that probably on socials. If it seems worthy of an episode, we will do that. But for now, that's all I have to say on that matter. In tangent, a question that I've received more in real life and from guests and things like that is what reception has really been like. And I've said before that it's been largely positive, but I think I would even move to say that it's been quite enthusiastic. Apparently, a lot of people have had the same questions I've had growing up and have noticed the same things I have. And even people who had never noticed before are like, wow, I didn't know that. They've been super fascinated and interested in this work and learning more, just like I have. And, of course, there's been the flip side where, like I talked about before, there's been people who haven't been receptive, who are more focused on the harms we've done to each other as communities. And, I'm not going to change everybody's hearts and minds, but for the most part, people have been super enthusiastic. And even still, uncovering those hurts and engaging with those responses has given me more understanding about where all of that's coming from. And it's kind of further validated the mission of this podcast for me, because I think if we focus more on the connections, that helps to heal those wounds, if that makes sense. So even where there's been negativity, it's kind of spun into a positive for me, which has been super great. A question I've received more from fellow creators in the space has been what has been most surprising to me this season. And of course, besides the positive reception, I couldn't have dreamed of such a positive reception. I think, honestly, it's been the guests. Of course, I researched all of my guests. I curated them. I know that they're incredible and cool, and I'm glad that y'all got to see that too. But I don't know that y'all know this, but they are truly so kind. And I could never have expected that. You hope people are nice, but when I say they've been genuinely kind, they've shared such kind words of affirmation, genuine enthusiasm for the show, and were just generally thoughtful to my point of view as well. And I always walk away from my interviews feeling so happy and validated. And I think people think I just am bluffing when I get on to socials and say, oh my gosh, I've just had the best interview with so-and-so, or when I send emails to my guests and I'm like, oh my gosh, I had so much fun. It was a blast. But truly it has been each and every time. They've been so kind and so gracious. And that has been a surprise because I have been a podcast guest. I've had guests on other podcasts that I've, coordinated with. And, sometimes people are just there to do the podcast, and that's super normal and super fine. But to have been met with such kindness has been a very lovely surprise. And so far we're 15 for 15, because I've had 16 episodes, but Janina twice. So 15 for 15. And yes, I'm counting my dad because he's very kind. And with that brings us to our final question. Is this the end of Culture by Culture? Of course not. Absolutely not. I have so many ideas, too many ideas, way, way more ideas than I even have the time to explore. So the real question is, what's happening going forward? What do we have to look forward to in the next season? Like I said, I have so many ideas, more than I have time for. So first and foremost, I'm getting an editor. Anybody who knows, and they are cheering for me. You can join in. Let's all clap. Look, I enjoy piecing together the episode in post, making my guests sound good, making sure it's listenable for you at home or in your car, wherever you're getting your podcast right now, in your earbuds. But it just takes away so much time. I know that's so cliche to say. I know all the podcasters, YouTubers, you name it, they all say it, but it's true. It takes away much needed time from pre-production, which is so vital to my show and other projects that I have, like Black and Asian Cultural Connections You Should Know, which is on Instagram. And I didn't mean to pause it, but we just have not had time between my day job and doing this podcast. So I am very much looking forward to freeing up that time, seeing what's going to happen with that, and seeing what I can do with all this free time. Currently, I've decided to take the leap and pay for the editor from my savings, but I would very much like to be able to pay for them through the podcast without having to dip into my savings. So if you'd like to support me in that goal, you can join on Patreon or send a one-off support thing through Ko-fi, Venmo, Cash App, whatever those individual apps call it. There's also, I think, PayPal. All the links are in the show notes, as always, so just go there. I think also Spotify has a tipping feature. So if you're in the app and you just want to handle it directly there, you don't know anything about those other apps. Fair. I get it. So you can always do that through Spotify also as well. What am I going to be doing while I'm gone? Super exciting, fun admin work. I know it's not that interesting. And if you want to hear about it in detail, I'll probably include more of it in my monthly updates on Patreon. I don't want to bore y'all, but just know that all this behind the scenes work that I'm going to be doing that I haven't had time for is going to very much be serving the things that will be coming out in a couple months on the front end. So, speaking of the things on the front end, I know you're like, get to the meat and potatoes, lady. I want to know, what do we have to look forward to in season 2? I hear you. So, as for next season, there's a lot I want to do. I've already got some stuff in the works. I've got some interviews scheduled. Ooh, tea. I've got some more cool friends I want to talk to. I have the coolest friends. If you know my friends or know any of the work I've done before, you can probably throw a stone in any direction and get pretty close to who might be on this podcast. I would also really love to get more international perspectives as to Afro-Asian pop cultural ties. So that's something I'm looking towards. And I would also very much like to introduce show retrospectives into the mix. This is something I talked about, I believe, in the trailer and probably somewhere on social media or maybe the website. I don't know. But I talked about wanting to do show retrospectives, especially shows or movies that deal with an Afro-Asian element. I'd like to have episodes, whether they're solo episodes again or episodes with guests, talking about those elements within whatever piece of media we're discussing. So I'm thinking maybe something like Mississippi Masala or Itaewon Class. And I will also open it up. If you have recommendations as far as show retrospectives, please let me know. I have a list, but I could always add more. I'll open up the Spotify question sticker. In fact, every episode has a question sticker. So if you're in the Spotify app, it's real easy to just reply to the question. So if you have recommendations, let me know. And if you want to go back on past episodes and look at those question stickers, feel free. In general, though, for this season, I'm just so looking forward to getting a little creative with the format and being able to explore a bit of deeper cut items, you know? Of course, we'll also do the basic anime fans, K-drama. I will not be able to help it. We will be doing those things also as well. So I'm very excited. Until that season, you can follow me at Culture X Podcast on Instagram, Twitter, kind of a little bit. Also, YouTube. Did you know you can get this podcast on YouTube? It's on YouTube, but also there's a comment section on YouTube. I'm in there. You can also check me out on the community feature. I don't use it as much on YouTube, but I'll start. And maybe TikTok. I don't know. We'll see about that. One. There will still be content going out on those platforms, especially Instagram. You will not miss me too much, I promise. I'll also keep you up to date on all the things going on as far as season 2. You can also get all that information on Patreon if that's where you want to subscribe. You're like, I don't like social media. Go ahead. You can just follow on Patreon, I think. I don't think you even have to give a dollar amount to follow for the general updates, but obviously also if you pay to a tier, you'll get all of that information and more. So I will see you all over in those various places. And until season 2, keep it chill and keep it nerdy.